It's the early morning hours of February 24, and Russia just launched its invasion of Ukraine.
War in Europe on a scale not seen since World War II.
Russia has invaded Ukraine.
The 15th attack column of the Russian army is crossing the border. It's part of thousands of military units converging on one objective: the city of Kyiv, the Ukrainian capital.
But in this attack column, some units are different.
Some of them actually aren't regular soldiers. They're units from the Rosguardia, the equivalent of the National Guard.
Closer to a police force than actual frontline soldiers.
They've been told they would not participate in active fighting and were tasked with patrolling the streets of liberated Kyiv, maintaining order in a city under Russian occupation. According to a plan drafted by the Russian military, the first units to enter Ukraine were expected to arrive in Kyiv a mere 13 hours after crossing the border.
Not only did they not make it in time, but they actually never made it there.
The members of Rosguardia that crossed the border on that day were widely unprepared for what was ahead. They had brought with them riot equipment, but found themselves caught in artillery barrages. A lot of them would flee, others would refuse to fight, and were brought back home and dismissed.
A good chunk of the roughly 200,000 soldiers Russia sent to take over Ukraine would be stuck in one of the most costly traffic jams in human history.
The battle for Kyiv was a turning point. By failing to capture Kyiv, Russia jumped into the unknown with no clear plan, no good exit strategy.
I want to go back to the very beginning of Putin's war.
Not the play-by-play of how Russia lost the first phase of the war, but the deeper reasons behind that failure and the key moments that I think explain the reasons behind that failure. As the Ukrainian war is about to enter its second year, I want to talk about the Russian push to take the Ukrainian capital in just a few days, the military and political deficiencies behind what turned out to be a Russian defeat.
I want to talk about how Russia lost the battle for Kyiv.
Мною принято решение о проведении специальной военной операции.
Раз, два, три! Ура! Ура!
So first, I want to go back to a moment just before the war.
Russian troops have yet to enter Ukraine and are posted along the border. And as tensions are rising, the Russian president meets with a number of high-ranking Russian officials.
It's a James Bond villain-style meeting.
A highly orchestrated one.
In all likelihood, the decision to invade Ukraine has already been taken.
But there's one telling detail. During the meeting, the head of the SVR, the powerful Russian Foreign Intelligence Service, stumbles and is publicly humiliated by President Putin.
В противном случае вы предлагаете начать переговорный процесс?
Нет, я...
Или признавать суверенитет их?
А я
Говорите прямо.
Я поддержу предложение о признании.
Поддержу или поддерживаю? Говорите прямо, Сергей.
Поддерживаю предложение.
Так и скажите, да или нет.
Да. Поддерживаю предложение о вхождении Донецкой и Луганской народных республик в состав Российской Федерации.
Да, мы об этом не говорим, мы этого не обсуждаем. Мы говорим о признании их независимости или нет.
Да. Я поддерживаю предложение о признании независимости.
Хорошо, пожалуйста, садитесь, спасибо.
Now, this seemed like just another anecdote at the time, but I think it was the sign of something bigger.
You see, the fear you could see on the face of one of Russia's most powerful men tells you everything you need to know about whether there could be any sort of pushback or just a more realistic assessment of how the war would go.
I want to show that it's not just that Putin was deceived by his general, it's that he built a system of self-deception. And this system explains how Russia may have lost the battle for Kyiv even before it started.
And it begins with the decision to capture Kyiv.
The war began 8 years ago and the front line in eastern Ukraine was frozen for years. But President Putin made the bet that he could finish off Ukraine in just a few days. A lot hinged on that single battle. Taking Kyiv would in Russia's mind lead to the collapse of the Ukrainian government, which would in turn lead to the collapse of the Ukrainian army. The Russian president had effectively decided to go for the heart in the hope of finishing up the war without having to engage in a protracted conflict.
The same conflict we're in right now.
A year on, we have many pieces of evidence that Moscow thought it could quickly end the war by capturing Kyiv. Documents were found on Russian soldiers, showing the war was measured in days rather than months. A New York Times investigation released leaked plans with the timing of the invasions, and these plans show that some of the units were due to arrive in Kyiv in a matter of hours.
That's the military equivalent of a walk in the park.
Now, the fact that capturing Kyiv was almost the entire Russian plan says a lot about the Kremlin's assessment of the state of both the Russian and Ukrainian army.
Sometimes the way we see our enemy is a projection of how we see ourselves.
And the Russia we see today is one that's extremely centralized, a system built upon one man, President Putin. The belief that by taking out Kyiv and Zelensky, the whole of Ukraine would collapse is perhaps the original mistake behind all others.
It would prove to be a tremendous miscalculation.
But it also fits with President Putin's cloak and dagger mentality and his background as a spy, rather than as a military commander.
But the Russian president had reasons to believe it could be done.
Let's go back to the actual beginning of the war in 2014. At the time, Russia mounted one of the most successful and rapid takeover in recent history.
Russian troops spreading out throughout the strategic Crimean Peninsula. President Obama...
In just a few days, little green men, Russian soldiers passing as local militias, effectively seized the strategic Crimean Peninsula on the Black Sea.
They rapidly overwhelmed a very unprepared Ukrainian army. More importantly, President Putin took the decision to invade Crimea in spite of the opinion of the Russian military brass.
Now, this stunning success and the fact that the Russian president took the decision against the advice of his entourage, I think is one of the main factors behind the Russian decision years later to escalate the war and launch a full-scale invasion.
By then, President Putin would be only surrounded by yes men.
As the Russian president made his decision to invade Ukraine, we know that the actual Russian experts on Ukraine were not even consulted. They may have been able to tell Putin how wrong his decision and expectation that the whole of Ukraine would collapse were.
This is also why President Zelensky's decision to stay in Kyiv was so important.
Remember that moment when the Americans offered Zelensky to exfiltrate him out? The Ukrainian president famously responded, "I need ammunition, not a ride."
This is one of these rare moments when the fate of the war could really have been tipped by the decision of one single man.
Remember, a few months back, the Afghan president fled Kabul, which really contributed to the collapse of the Afghan army and the takeover of the country by the Taliban. This is what Putin likely had in mind as he gave the green light for the invasion.
But there's a deeper story behind that decision
that explains why President Putin may have thought Zelensky would actually take that right. And it has to do with the image of President Zelensky. Russian president saw Zelensky as a clown, a pushover he could easily extract concessions from. The Russian president had the image of Zelensky as this naive and idealistic leader, a former actor, a social media sensation that wouldn't last 2 seconds under fire. When Zelensky won the elections in 2019, this was interpreted as a sign by the Kremlin that now was the time to finally get some concessions. And Zelensky had in fact signaled that he was willing to talk to Russia.
To look in the eyes of Putin and solve the conflict.
Which I think was really interpreted by the Kremlin as a sign of weakness. Hours into the invasion, the Ukrainian president would actually send a clear message that he had no intention to leave. And he would consistently repeat that message in the streets of Kyiv as Russian troops were making their way to the Ukrainian capital, defying the Russian expectation that Zelensky would flee and that the Ukrainian capital would fall in just a matter of days.
Будемо захищати нашу державу, тому що наша зброя – це наша правда. Наша правда в тому, що це наша земля, наша країна, наші діти. І ми все це будемо захищати. Ось і все. Ось це і є те, що я хотів вам сказати. Слава Україні!
We're now close to a year into the conflict, and looking back, it may be easy to point out the deficiencies of the Russian military.
But we have to remember, a few days before the invasion, Russia wasn't the only one assessing that it could quickly take over Ukraine.
Even Western military analysts were predicting a quick Russian victory, and they were even preparing for an Afghan scenario, referring to the insurgency that pushed out the Soviet Union from Afghanistan. The US military command even warned that Kyiv could actually fall within 72 to 96 hours. Now, I think a key element behind this assessment was the so-called strength on paper of the Russian army, especially when you compare it to the Ukrainian one. If you look at the two armies on paper, the Russians had a significant advantage in both land forces, aircraft, artillery, and so on.
On the other side, the Ukrainian army was and still is a much smaller fighting force.
And one that Russia overwhelmed in 2014 in just a matter of days, if not hours.
But of course, this is just on paper.
In reality, the Ukrainian military Russia faced in 2014 and the one it faced in 2022 were very different. Now, it's clear that the military aid provided by Western countries played a role. I think the role of anti-tank missiles like the NLO or the Javelin has been discussed quite a bit. But I want to highlight factors that aren't discussed as often. The opposite of strength on paper.
What you could call the invisible factors of war.
This strength on paper is what's most discussed and used to compare militaries, and it makes sense. It's what's most visible to the naked eyes. But the difficult part of gauging military strength is to actually measure invisible factors. Army morale, cohesion, logistics, adaptability. This is where wars are won. And I'd argue that if you look at these factors, the balance was more clearly in favor of Ukraine. You see, the Ukrainian military didn't just receive military aid from the West. It also underwent a significant military reform, including one that I think proved particularly important: the reform of the chain of command. The chain of command tells you who is taking decisions. In the military, this goes from the generals to the senior staff junior officers, all the way down to the soldiers. But there are different ways to envision the chain of command, from a very centralized one that puts a lot of the decision-making process at the top, to one that spreads it out far more across the chain of command. And the Ukrainian military underwent a significant transformation in this area, moving away from a very centralized Soviet-style chain of command to NATO standards that put a lot more focus on what's called mid-level command. Now remember the concept, because it proved really critical in the battle for Kyiv. Mid-level command is the idea that your mid-level commander, the junior staff, the non-commissioned officers, should be able to make decisions. To do that, you need to give this mid-level command the tools to make those decisions, obviously. And that includes improving their understanding of the battlefield, the bigger picture, the concept behind your vision of the battle.
This really proved critical.
If most of the decisions are taken at the top, this means that it may take days, if not weeks, for military to adapt. At the beginning of the war, the Ukrainians were actually able to quickly adapt, and that's in no small part because of that concept. On the opposite side, the Russians would kind of bang their heads multiple times against the wall, doing the same thing over and over again, even after multiple failed attempts. Let's talk about another invisible factor, one that really chipped away at the Russian strength on paper: corruption. Corruption means that while the Russian army presented a very pretty facade, a look behind the curtain would quickly reveal just how decrepit it really was.
And there's no cruder look than the invasion of one of the largest countries in Europe,
which is one of the most complex operations you can carry out. It also means that the Russian army shines when carrying out limited, small operation with a number of well-trained troops rather than the whole of the Russian army. But the Russian army was kind of untested when it came to the logistics of massive invasions, something you don't really see nowadays. The first weeks of the Ukrainian invasion would put enormous stress on these fragilities. And remember, the Russian soldiers who were stationed close to Ukraine spent weeks in the cold, in very poor conditions in Russia, which tells you everything you have to know about the poor state of Russian logistics.
And in fact, they were lied to.
We've always said the troops will return to their bases after the exercises are over.
The Russian leadership effectively deceived its own soldiers by claiming that the deployments were just exercises. Later, they would lie again, claiming that Ukrainians were about to welcome Russian soldiers with open arms. But perhaps more importantly, the Kremlin completely failed in the lead-up to the war to explain why the special operation was necessary.
Attempts to deceive the West and Ukraine really backfired.
This is critical as a soldier. Knowing why you fight, why you put yourself in harm's way, is half of the battle. For all the talk about the Russian hybrid warfare and disinformation, the Kremlin actually did quite a poor job in convincing its own population that the war was necessary.
Now, these invisible factors, morale, adaptability, logistics, the belief that you are fighting a just war, are what really prevented the Russian strength on paper from actually materializing.
Defeat is when these factors become visible. And they became quite visible during the first hours of the battle for Kyiv. This is the Hostomel airport. During the first hours of the invasion, Russian airborne troops launched an offensive against this airport, which is situated just 15 kilometers from Kyiv. The goal was to seize the airport very quickly, to pave the way for the arrival of a number of Russian heavy transports packed with reinforcements. The Hostomel Offensive was really the opening move of the Kyiv battle, and is the perfect example of how all of those invisible factors I just talked about would stack up against Russia.
If the whole idea of the invasion was to put a dagger through Ukraine's heart, the Hostomel Offensive was really the tip of that knife.
Initially, the Russian offensive worked well. A number of attack helicopters destroyed the airport defenses before units of the VDV, the Russian paratroopers, stormed it.
The Ukrainians were in fact taken by surprise by how fast the Russians launched their offensive.
And that's despite the fact that we know that the CIA had in fact warned the Ukrainian leadership that Moscow was planning to take over Hostomel. But there's a reason why the Ukrainians were surprised.
You see, the air assault left the Russian paratroopers extremely exposed.
Not only that, but the precondition for the success of such a bold offensive was that Ukrainian air defenses and aircraft would be destroyed. That was critical if the goal of the VDV offensive was to land additional troops at the airport. But as Russian helicopters flew to Hostomel, Ukrainian air defenses were still standing. Hours before, the Russians had launched hundreds of missiles against airfields across Ukraine. The missile strikes were based on what's called a bank of targets, a series of coordinates gathered by Russian intelligence. The strike was deemed a success, except it wasn't, for a very simple reason.
Just hours before the strike, Ukrainian air defenses and aircraft had been moved.
The Russians may have been able to spot this, but acting upon that information requires significant flexibility and time, which the Russians at that time lacked.
Instead, they just hit empty fields.
Hours later, the Russian airborne troops at Hostomel would pay the price for that mistake. Russian aircraft tasked with mopping up nearby Ukrainian units never reached the airport. And the Russian aircraft also providing air support flew without any accompanying fighter jets to protect them, thinking that the Ukrainian Air Force and air defenses were no more. Several of them would be shot down by Ukrainian jets that took them by surprise by flying at low altitude. Others would just be shot down by Ukrainian air defenses. The Russian plan didn't allow for any kind of deviation, not to mention the lack of a strong mid-level command that we spoke about earlier meant that it would actually take days to relay these failures back to the decision makers. Just hours after the Russians had launched the operation to take Hostomel, Ukrainian forces near the airport counterattacked. They used artillery to pin down the Russian paratroopers who ended up fleeing in the nearby woods. As they desperately called for help, some of the forward units of the Russian army who had just crossed the border rushed towards Hostomel, becoming targets for Ukrainian light troops equipped with anti-tank weapons. They eventually made it to the airport, but when they did, the Hostomel airport could no longer be used to bring in reinforcements. What that means is the air bridge that was supposed to be the tip of Russia's dagger-to-the-heart strategy never materialized.
What did materialize is this.
A 60-kilometer-long traffic jam of military vehicles between the Ukrainian border with Belarus and the Ukrainian capital. The Hostomel air assault was supposed to trigger some form of collapse of the Ukrainian defenses, which meant Russia would be able to push as many units as possible into the country. But when that plan failed in Hostomel, the massive amount of troops and vehicles that were sent to Kyiv got stuck. They would become a fairly easy target for the Ukrainian artillery. In no small part because some of the first things those Russian soldiers did was to call back home.
Короче, вы в кольце, да, сейчас? Мы в очке.
The Russians have shown very little awareness of another important concept in modern warfare:
operational security, or OPSEC.
In the lead up to the war, footage of Russian tanks driving out of railway stations would trickle down the internet, sometimes filmed by the Russian soldiers themselves. I also think that after weeks of wondering what these so-called exercises were for, a lot of the Russian soldiers were just calling back home to tell their family that they were going into Ukraine. In the first hours of the invasion, a Ukrainian anti-crime unit that specialized in monitoring telecommunication spotted a huge spike in phone calls from Russian numbers along the border. They passed that information, including coordinates, along the military command of the Ukrainian army. And here again, the lack of culture of individual initiative of mid-level command in the Russian army crippled any sort of reaction. Although it was clear that units were stuck and the situation lasted for days, it took a very long time for the Russian military leadership to realize it and take actions. And the action they took, perhaps the only one they could take given how centralized decision-making is, was to send generals to remove this huge traffic jam. Unsurprisingly, these generals would also become a target for Ukrainian troops, and by the time they arrived, the 3-day walk in the park had turned into a logistical nightmare. By that time, the front line near Kyiv had largely stabilized, and the Ukrainians had adopted a fairly simple strategy to defend Kyiv. They used natural obstacles, particularly the Irpin River, which represented a natural defensive line for the Ukrainian capital. It's not a surprise to see that the river and the cities bordering it saw some of the heaviest battle of the early phase of the war. Cities like Demidov, Moshun, Irpin, and also the now infamous Bucha, where Russians massacred civilians. Very early during the war, Ukrainians blew up bridges across a set of rivers. The fate of other cities, like the sovereign city of Kherson, for instance, would be sealed by Ukrainian failure to implement a similar plan. Now, this Ukrainian strategy may seem simple, and in fact, it is. But it worked. There's this misconception that with the emergence of tanks, amphibious vehicles, fighter jets, missiles, natural obstacles, the sort of oldest trick in the book doesn't work anymore. But they do, and they present a very significant challenge if you're not ready to quickly overcome them. And it's not that the Russians didn't think about it. They were planning to use PMPs, which are bridges that you can quickly deploy. But those bridges are old and quite sensitive to the rise of water levels.
More importantly, what I think the Russians hadn't really planned was that they would have to cross these rivers under enemy fire.
Now, these river crossing operations are already pretty complex, but they become a nightmare when carried out under fire, particularly if your army isn't trained in another important concept. And another episode in the battle for Kyiv showed that the Russians just weren't very good at it.
Шестой полк пока не могу доложить, пока собираю. Очень много потерь. Ждали. Голова колонны.
The other leg of the offensive was east of Kyiv. By the time the Belarus axis failed, this other axis, east of Kyiv, was also running into a series of problems. The first was that cities that were expected to fall quickly in the first days of the war, like Kharkiv, Sumy, or Chernihiv, just didn't. In the early days of the war, the Russian command made a decision. They would bypass those cities, push ahead, and bomb them to oblivion with as much firepower as possible.
Once again, the thought behind that decision was that if you pushed deeper inside Ukraine, the whole of the Ukrainian military, of the Ukrainian government would collapse. But it just didn't.
In fact, this was one of the crucial mistakes the Russian military command made. By bypassing these cities, they made it possible for light units of the Ukrainian military to harass the increasingly thin supply lines of the Russian army. But perhaps more importantly, as they went deeper inside Ukraine, the Russian ability to move units in a coherent manner completely collapsed. I'm referring here to the concept of combined arms. It's the principle that units of different types need to work together. Infantry needs to work with tanks to lead the way, helicopters and some jets are providing air support to ground units, artillery are used to soften target before any attack, ground units guide artillery, anti-aircraft systems protect ground units, etc., etc. It's a pretty simple principle, but it becomes much more complex when you are fighting the enemy. It really takes a very well-trained force to maintain that sort of cohesion when you're already hundreds of kilometers inside the enemy territory. Technically, the Russian army was well-versed in this concept. I mean, the very name of their armies is combined armed armies. And what that means is they built these entire military units around the concept.
But weeks into the invasion, it really felt like the Russian army had completely tossed the concept away.
And nothing illustrates this failure better than the offensive Russia launched on March 9 to capture the critical town of Brovary. On this day, Russia sent a column of dozens of tanks, hoping to break the stalemate around Kyiv by focusing on a different front. The tank column was sent without any form of support, and it quickly became stuck as tanks ahead didn't manage to push through the Ukrainian defenses.
Then, Ukrainian forces had a field day.
They would use drones to guide artillery strikes against the column, anti-tank missiles to attack Russian tanks, and because the Russian army was coming into a very urban area and hadn't really secured its advances, they also were quite exposed to any forward Ukrainian units. This long line of tanks was very easy to block. Just one or two destroyed tanks or any other obstacles would make it difficult for the others to move. Not to mention again that because there is no mid-level command in the Russian military, the Russians failed to quickly adapt. And there's this intercepted call between a Russian commander who's describing what a nightmare the offensive was turning into and really facing a lack of understanding from the Russian command. This was one of the last major offensive actions of the Battle for Kyiv. After that, the front line would remain frozen for a couple of weeks before the Russian leadership took the decision to withdraw. It would take around a month for Russia to effectively restart its operations with focus on eastern Ukraine. That's both a lot and nothing when you consider all the lessons that the Russian military command had to learn from this massive debacle. And this really had strategic implications for Russia. See, the goal of the operation was to quickly bring Ukraine to heel, hoping that a swift operation would really create that fait accompli effect and shock Ukraine's allies into the same kind of muted response that we had seen after the Crimea takeover. Even today, it doesn't feel like Russia has fully been able to recalibrate its broader strategic goals. What was supposed to be a blitzkrieg bonanza has turned into a war of attrition, in which time may not be on Russia's side, particularly as it doesn't seem like Russia really drew the lessons from the first phase of the offensive.
I'll explore the conflict in Ukraine and other conflicts in my next videos, but in the meantime, thank you for watching.